She did for the man the work of a woman. His passion caressed and embraced her for 6 days and 7 nights. Enkidu was erect as he coupled with Shamhat. No, that is too much. Welcome to Unit 1, Module 2 of Pre-Modern World History, the Eastern Mediterranean, roughly 4000 BCE to about 550 BCE. This module, no more talking about the evolution or the dawn of Homo sapiens sapiens. We're going to get on to societies and quickly onto the first iterations of the written word, ever more closer to when I feel comfortable talking about history. We're going to start this series of lectures with the Epic of Gilgamesh. Some of you may be familiar. You may have, if you're very nerdy and shameful, have read it in AP history, or if you're like me and slightly less nerdy and shameful, you would have read the cliff notes to it in AP history. But it's an epic set in the kingdom of Uruk, which we'll talk about, that is going to give us a good idea, as we'll see, not exactly of life in Uruk per se, but going to give us a good idea of how the educated classes of Uruk saw the world around them and saw their own place in that world versus people outside of the educated classes and outside of the city walls. From there, very, very quickly, we're going to talk about Akkadian society, Assyrian society, ancient Egypt, and then on to Neo-Babylonia and the Hebrew kingdoms. So it's going to be a whirlwind this time, of very ancient places, but hopefully pretty interesting. We're going to get into it, again, as I said, by looking at the story of Gilgamesh. So let me just give you a little bit of background before I read to you from the Epic of Gilgamesh. The setting is this, and we're starting at the beginning of the story. Gilgamesh is not a great king. He is exerting a sort of monarchical right to sleep with any woman in his kingdom that he wants to at any time that he wants to. The original tablets that we have are broken, where it details what exactly it is he's forcing the men in his society to do, but it appears that he's either forcing them to constantly be involved in some kind of game for his entertainment, or some form of sport or competition that is exhausting them and oppressing them for his own, as I said, entertainment. So everyone here in the city of Uruk, the city-state of Uruk, is basically a plaything for our king Gilgamesh. The people then, upset by this, pray to their gods, Anu and Ishtar, and they ask them, please, you must do something. So Anu hatches a plan. Gods of what? Never you mind. Anu, god of never you mind, hatches a plan to have a lesser god, Aruru, send down a friend for Gilgamesh, someone who's going to physically, mentally be his match, someone who's going to entertain him, someone who's going to distract him and keep him from oppressing the people as he has. And so that's where our story is going to pick up. As we read it, watch for how our authors, our unknown authors, just educated people of Uruk, are talking about Enkidu, this person who's supposed to be a match for Gilgamesh, how they're, ways that they depict the uneducated, what is it that brings you into civilization, what happens once you're civilized, that kind of thing. So let's jump into our story and see what happens. Okay, and so after the events that I just described, the story of Gilgamesh goes like this. They summoned Aruru, the Great One. You, Aruru, created mankind, now fashioned what Anu has thought of. Let him be a match for the storm of his heart, his here being Gilgamesh. Let them vie with each other, so Uruk may be rested. The goddess Aruru heard these words. What Anu had thought of, she fashioned within her. The goddess Aruru, she washed her hands, took a pinch of clay, threw it down in the wild. In the wild she created Enkidu, the Hiru, offspring of silence, knit strong by Ninurta. All his body is matted with hair. He bears long tresses like those of a woman. The hair of his head grows thickly as barley. He knows not a people, nor even a country. Coated in hair like the god of the animals, with the gazelles he grazes on grasses, joining the throng with the game at the waterhole, his heart delighting with the beasts in the water. So right at the outset, we have a kind of human made of clay, to borrow from a different origin of humankind type story, a different ancient tale, sort of an Adam figure living at one with nature, at one with the animals, in a sort of Eden kind of experience. Now, that's not a very good metaphor past that point, because of course Uruk already exists, there already is civilization and things like that. But what you get here in the story, and you'll see this very quickly, is Enkidu as a symbol of purity, as a symbol of a state of pure and innocent nature that is going to stand opposed to the civilized people of Uruk and the way they live their lives. And very quickly, he does become a problem for them. In particular, he becomes a problem for a local trapper who sees Enkidu and becomes afraid. Of course, there's this super hairy guy running around with gazelles and what have you, living like an animal. It's pretty scary. But not just that, he's messing with the trapper's livelihood. He's undoing his traps. He's setting the animals free. This becomes a major problem. So let's see how the trapper describes him. The trapper says this. He says, "There was a man came by the waterhole, mightiest in the land. Strength he possesses. His strength is as mighty as a rock from the sky. Over the hills he roams all day. Always with the herd he grazes on grasses. Always his tracks are found by the waterhole. I am afraid, and I dare not approach him. He fills in the pits that I myself dig. He pulls up the snares that I lay. He sets free from my grasp all the beasts of the field. He stops me doing the work of the wild." Who is our trapper saying this to? He's complaining to none other than King Gilgamesh himself. So Gilgamesh hatches a plan. Said Gilgamesh to him, the hunter, "Go, hunter, take with you Shamhat, the harlot." Here, Shamhat is a harlot. In your text, you will see Shamhat is also understood to be a priestess. That's going to be evidence of a certain division of labor that this new agricultural society can afford. They've got enough food that people can spend all day thinking about how to commune with the gods. They don't have to be involved, or at least certain classes of people don't have to be involved directly in producing grain. Gilgamesh says, "When the herd comes down to the waterhole, she should strip off her raiment to reveal her charms. He will see her and will approach her. His herd will spurn him, though he grew up amongst it." What's happening here, and in the story, Gilgamesh is not the first person to suggest that Shamhat, the harlot, be used to entrap Enkidu. But what's happening here is our trapper has explained what's going on. Enkidu, as a force of nature, is a problem for him. And what they plan to do is to steal his innocence, to bring him into manhood through having sex with Shamhat. So they're going to lay a trap for him like this. Once he's had sex with her, his relationship to nature is supposed to change. Let's see how that unfolds. "With the gazelles he grazed on grasses, joining the throng with the game at the waterhole, in his heart delighting with the beasts in the water. Then Shamhat saw him, the child of nature, the savage man from the midst of the wild. 'This is he, Shamhat. Uncradle your bosom, bear your sex, let him take in your charms. Do not recoil, but take in his scent. He will see you and will approach you. Spread your clothing so he may lie on you. Do for the man the work of a woman. Let his passion caress and embrace you. His herd will spurn him, though he grew up amongst it.' Shamhat unfastened the cloth of her loins. She bared her sex, and he took in her charms. She did not recoil. She took in his scent. She spread her clothing, and he lay upon her." So, the trap has been set. The trap is working. One thing I would remind you of is that Gilgamesh, although it is the earliest written human story, still would have existed for a while as an oral epic. What you've just seen is a text that, while exciting in this trap that has been laid, is also incredibly repetitive. And we're going to see that a lot this semester, that these older stories repeat themselves over and over again, the same phrases, the same verbiage, over and over again. Why? They exist for centuries as oral epics before they get written down. How do you remember an epic if it's so long, things like that? It rhymes. It repeats a lot, this sort of thing. This is how you keep in mind, if you are one of the storytellers of whatever relevant society, how you keep in your head what happens in this story. Let's see where it goes. Enkidu had defiled his body so pure. His legs stood still, though his herd was in motion. Enkidu was weakened, could not run as before, but now he had reason and wide understanding. Now pause here, friends. Reason does not mean now he had excuse, now he had explanation. Now he has instead logic, philosophy, enlightenment. He sees the world around him for what it is. He's become a fully thinking and reasoning, and in some ways educated human being. He has, again, to borrow from a Hebrew tradition, which we'll talk about later in these lectures, he has bitten from the fruit of knowledge, sort of. And the result of that fruit of knowledge is he is now separated irrevocably from nature. He came back and sat at the feet of the harlot, watching the harlot, observing her features. Then the harlot's words he listened intently, as Shamhat talked to him, to Enkidu. You are handsome, Enkidu. You are just like a god. Why with the beasts do you wander the wild? Come, I will take you to Uruk the sheepfold, to the sacred temple, home of Anu and Ishtar, where Gilgamesh is perfect in strength, like a wild bull lording it over the menfolk. So she spoke to him, and her word found favor. He knew by instinct he should seek a friend. And there you have it. So, there's a lot going on here. I mean, the story itself is a little lascivious, but that's fine. We're not here to judge. What's interesting about this story, there's a little bit about gender roles we can read here, doing what a woman should do and that kind of thing on the part of Shamhat. But there's also something here about how the author or authors, it is of course anonymous, it's a very old story, would have seen themselves as educated, someone able to commit this story into writing, living in a city-state, looking out on those outside of their educated world. How do they see these people? How do they see maybe who these people think they used to be in an earlier time? Or how they see, the barbarians, the uncivilized that are living outside their gates. They're covered in hair, they're disgusting, they run with the animals, but they can be brought into civilization. Now, that bringing into civilization comes with a cost. You are separated from a supposed state of nature with the animals and all that. Once you gain the gift of reason and understanding, you are divided, and there's no going back over that divide. But the benefits from gaining from gaining reason, from gaining understanding, the benefits are great indeed. So these people are a little satisfied with themselves and what they have achieved compared to probably smaller surrounding civilizations. I'm not going to take that away from them entirely, but it's an interesting thing to note even here in the earliest human story that survives. You already have a division between the haves, the have-nots, the educated and the uneducated. You already have certain forms of oppression being recounted. You already have a looking down on by some people against others. So it's with that I think we should go into this lecture. All of those things are already here. Now, Gilgamesh is obviously more than just the story of Enkidu sort of being civilized through sexual intercourse and then, losing his connection to nature, although I find that to be, for me, the most interesting part of the story. It's also an epic, so Gilgamesh and Enkidu, they have to run around, they killing monsters, stealing lumber and things like that. If you look at the map on your screen, you'll see as they head sort of northeast, up north of Syria, there's a point in the story where they go to a cedar forest and kill the guardian of that forest, Humbaba. Gilgamesh kills him at Enkidu's prodding. Enkidu says it will make him, seal his reputation forever if he kills him. Eventually in the story, Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh has to go into the underworld trying to bring him back. And so then the whole story switches from this kind of fear of nature and humanity's separation from nature through reason and things like that, into this kind of long study on mortality. And you wind up watching a lot of the story is Gilgamesh dealing with the concept of mortality. But let's leave Gilgamesh there for a second, and let's talk about the region itself. A region where Gilgamesh would have, at least according to most historians, actually been king sometime between 2900 and 2300 BCE. It's quite a wide range, but sometime in there, Gilgamesh, an actual person, probably was the king of an actual city-state, Uruk. And it would have been sort of here. So if you see the green there on your map where it says Sumer, that is the place where we are, at least for the next little bit of this lecture. Uruk and places like it in Mesopotamia around Sumer, Sumer, these are the earliest, what historians, especially of ancient humanity, call complex societies. Now recall when we were talking about Çatalhöyük in what becomes Turkey last time, this was about 6000 BCE, and the city had about 5,000 people, and that was massively large for the earliest days. By 3100 BCE, when Uruk comes onto the scene, in southern Mesopotamia, we're dealing with a place that has 40 or 50,000 people, so as many as almost 10 times as large as Çatalhöyük would have been. So this is quite a huge improvement in 3,000 years. Well, improvement. Advance in a morally neutral term. More people, better agriculture, better able to sustain divisions of labor and things like that. Now, I've said complex society, but what is that? A complex society, at least according to most historians, is characterized by a large urban center with specialized labor and social stratification, as well as the belief that rulers and deities were entitled to the surpluses the society produced. So that rulers and deities are going to be doing this through temples or through the ruler themselves if they claim some special connection to a deity. They are extracting from the people around them, from the agricultural society around them, surplus. They're saying, there's a bare minimum that these farming folk need to live, and then there's the extra that they make. And we are going to take that extra that they make from them. And we'll get into shortly why this is so important, this extraction of surplus. But this is nonetheless a complex society. The surplus that these societies are able to create is far larger than Neolithic societies, some of the places we were talking about last time. And although it is very common in complex societies, it's not necessarily the case that they have to develop writing. When we look at ancient Sumer, when we look at Egypt, we are going to see places that developed writing, but that is not going to be the case everywhere. Now, this transition to complex societies, as you can sort of see from the transition from Çatalhöyük and what would become Turkey to Uruk and the sort of broader region of Sumer, this is a transition that takes thousands of years. But once these societies are established, these are far more the domain of historians than societies we would have been looking at before, which are properly the work of archaeologists. So the transition to complex societies took thousands of years. We find these societies first emerging here, again in Mesopotamia. The question justifiably emerges, where did the Mesopotamians come from? The answer is the eastern Mediterranean and western Turkey. And as they migrate east into Mesopotamia, what will become very shortly Sumer, this region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they are having a very tough life. This is a region where there's not enough rainfall to support farming, so you can't just depend on precipitation alone. There are no naturally occurring wild grains, so any grains that they wanted to farm to sustain their society, they would have had to have brought with them from their homelands. And finally, the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates meant the destruction of crops and homes. This is one reason, just briefly to go back to Gilgamesh, you get a flood story in Gilgamesh far before it emerges with Noah in the Hebrew Bible. You get a flood story here talking about a massive flood that sweeps the earth and things like that. As we'll say again later, historians mostly believe that this flood story, the flood story in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, these are amalgamations of many, many floods. It's sort of the memory of hundreds, dozens of floods, sort of mashed together in one single story of one very epic flood. Nonetheless, this region, this Mesopotamia, was slowly settled through the success of public irrigation works between 6000 and 5000 BCE. So right out of the gate, we have this sort of humanity exerting a certain force over nature, trying to control nature, trying to dominate nature in some way. Here, in a hydrological sense, demanding where water will go and where water will not go. So irrigation necessary to make agriculture possible in Mesopotamia. And while the villages began as quite small, by 4000 BCE, some of these places in Mesopotamia were walled urban centers with over 10,000 people. So it's getting fairly large fairly quickly. Cities then, once irrigation is in place, once the hydrology of the region has been, to the best of one's ability in this time, mastered, cities survived on grain taxes from surrounding villages in exchange for protection. The surplus of these grain taxes was then stored in temples and would be used to, say, pay for an army, would be used to take care of the people in case of famine, something like that. The political model here is a city-state. A city-state is a city whose ruler governs both the city center and the surrounding countryside. And so Gilgamesh would have been one such ruler. And the city-state over which Gilgamesh ruled would not have been small, not by the standards of his day. One source reads, "Go up, pace out the walls of Uruk, study the foundation terrace, and examine the brickwork. Is not its masonry of kiln-fired brick? And did not 7 masters lay its foundation? 1 square mile of city, 1 square mile of gardens, 1 square mile of clay pits, a half square mile of Ishtar's dwelling." So a half square mile devoted simply to religious practice. 3.5 square miles is the measure of Uruk. So for its time, that is quite large. Now, it is worth pointing out that this source gets the brick making wrong. They were sun-dried mud bricks. They were not kiln-fired bricks, but the point stands nonetheless. The problem then, in understanding pre-modern states, understanding pre-modern societies, is how to get a sort of cellular understanding of this structure of government. Because I'm going to make the argument that this structure of government is repeated over and over again in the pre-modern world. Look at my face, hear my voice. If you want to understand pre-modern state structures, the government, what the government is and how it works, you need to begin by understanding pre-modern states as protection rackets in the sort of Sopranos sense. The way it works is Gilgamesh or someone like him comes into some form of wealth through taking it from someone else, through being born into it, however you like, comes into some form of wealth, and with that wealth gains a private army of at least enough size to threaten surrounding villages and surrounding farmers. With that military, with that wealth, what one does is simply set up a protection racket. You go to the village and you say, "Look, I am going to harm you unless you pay me an annual sum." Let's call that sum a tax. You pay me this annual sum, however, and I will not only not harm you, I will protect you from being harmed by other people like me. Now, this is painting with a very broad brush to say from Uruk to the Mongolian Empire, all pre-modern states are fundamentally protection rackets, but I'm comfortable doing that because we have to say something about the first 250,000 years of human history, and I think that that is something we can say. And this does actually differ from a modern state you might have in the 21st century. You think about any government of a nation state, say in the West, United States, Western Europe, something like that. And although this might be a little idyllic, the basic idea is that the government is a place that is supposed to provide for its citizens, which a protection racket would do, maintain a military and all these old things. But at the same time, there's supposed to be some sort of participation in the state by all of the citizenry, however that is defined. So you get that participation that is going to be across many different classes, social classes. That's going to be different other kinds of demographic groups, gender groups, ethnic groups, racial groups, however you like. Something like that. The idea is that all these groups are competing with each other in the government for representation of their interests. That is a very shallow definition, but it's one with which we can work because all we really need it for is to compare it to pre-modern states. None of that idea of participation is going to be here in these pre-modern states, with a few exceptions around, say, Rome. For the most part, the state is a protection racket. There's no participation. There's just pay us your taxes, and we will protect you. If you do not pay us our taxes, we will not protect you. In fact, we will harm you. Now, you're saying, oh, doesn't that sound too simple? Yes. But think of that as a sort of base structure. And then what you do is you build other concepts on top of it. So why do you have the right to run this protection racket? Well, it's not just that my military is the best. It is also I am chosen by some god. I have the mandate of heaven. Ishtar's favor shines on me. Something like that, right? That's also going to mean, because you have to run this protection racket efficiently, eventually you're going to see infrastructure getting into the mix. You have to move the taxes around that you're requiring people pay. So we're going to see a protection racket slowly developing roads, better military technology to compete with other protection rackets, other states around you, and that kind of thing. So we've got we'll have religion, we'll have infrastructure, we'll have forms of science and technology, especially military, at least in the earliest days. All those things sort of swirling around in this idea of the state. But if you can get protection racket and sort of see how the concept of the protection racket can be built upon in all the societies that we're going to look at, then you're really going to have something. Because I am very comfortable making the argument that every state, every society we will look at, its government is the main thing extracting resources from the people. It's the main thing taking the surplus product from the peasants, the farmers, however you want to call them, and redistributing that in some way. It is the sort of site where surplus is accumulated. It has to justify that in some way, materially, through infrastructure, through protecting people, but also culturally, through patroning religions and things like that. So if we got that, I think we've really got something we can work with. But let's talk about technology. Back to this slide one more time, just to say that it's during this period that stone gets replaced with bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. The wheel, unknown where it was invented, but one of the most important tools in early human history, also emerges during this time. Wheeled vehicles began as platforms moved on two logs. Then, by 3000 BCE, we have the advent of narrow carts. Then wheels with spokes, which are lighter, faster, and offer a little bit of suspension by 2500 BCE. We know in places like Uruk in Mesopotamia that specialization was taking place because the evidence of the same craft work in cities in this region, in Mesopotamia or Sumer, evidence of the same kinds of craft work is always found together in archaeological sites. So you go to a city, you find some site where a city once stood, and you say, wow, there's a whole bunch of clay pots all in one region of this city. Wow, there's a whole bunch of metal weaponry in one region of this city. Wow, there's a whole bunch of farm tool of whatever kind in this one region of the city. What you know is that the people living in that region made that thing full time. That tells us work specialization. And work specialization tells us on a societal level a certain amount of comfortability. Comfort? Let's say comfort. A certain amount of assurance that you're going to be able to produce enough grain with those who are farming that you don't need everyone to farm. You can have people doing other things involved in other kinds of craft works and other kinds of pursuits. Now, we said that writing was not necessary to define a society as a complex society, but it helps. Writing is developed in Mesopotamia around the year 3300 BCE. This is significant, a major important place for us to start our discussion of early human complex societies, because this is the first writing system, or at least the first one we've ever discovered. The first writing system in the world comes out of Mesopotamia, 3300 BCE. It's a writing system called Sumerian, after Sumer, which we saw on our map earlier, in southern Mesopotamia. Now, we need to think about how this writing is going to work. It's not the case that all pictures are writing. A picture might communicate something. Of course, a picture of an ox painted on a wall in a cave by some Neolithic individual, a picture of a herd of horses or something like that, does communicate something. It communicates what's important in their lives, what they thought was worth representing, what the sort of things they thought about. But it doesn't communicate something in the sense that one picture is one concept, or correlating to just one word. An early example of this is pictured on your screen. So if you look at this clay tablet here, you see a hand in the top left, and you see sort of three regions, I don't know what to call them, three little blocks of images on top of that horizontal line in the middle. And then below the line, it looks like a farming implement, it looks like crops and things like that. This is writing, not because it's pictures, but because these pictures are some agreed upon objects. That hand indicates ownership. Those three little sections on top, those are all enslaved people with their names, their written names in those little sections. And then we have the bottom section of this tablet alluding to the work that they are doing, helping us know they're slaves to what end. Merchandise in Sumer was first tracked through different sized clay objects. This would not have been what you see here. This would have been a sort of blank object, maybe with just a picture on it indicating generally what it represents. Markings were eventually made on these objects, these clay tablets, in a much more systematic way, and these were the first written documents in human history, almost all of them representing a transaction of some kind. So again, in the picture here, this is a transaction. This is essentially a receipt for the purchase of 3 enslaved people. Who's making this receipt? Who is inventing this writing? Who is overseeing trade? We're not living in a world in ancient Sumer where the economy is dominated by private merchants. We're living in a world in ancient Sumer where the economy is, and most exchanges are dominated by the state, and through the state, certain religious institutions like temples. Who's making these tablets? Again, it's going to be the people overseeing trade. It's going to be accountants in these temples, tracking the sale and purchase of different items, and most important, tracking the payment of taxes. How much tax was paid by whom? Do they owe anything more? Did they overpay? That sort of thing. Writing emerges. Last time I said we're going to learn about the state and it's going to be very boring and very exciting. Writing emerges through accountants monitoring, tracking, recording tax collection, the payment of taxes, and these sort of, as you see here, private transactions between other people, which would have had to have been approved through the temple. By 3300 BCE, there's a writing system finally in Sumerian of about 700 signs. Some of these signs are pictorial, meaning, for example, that hand at the top right of the clay pot, meaning ownership, is a picture of a hand. Not all of them. Some of them approached more like what an alphabet would be. So it's kind of a mixed system of these 700 signs. The region is Sumer. The language is Sumerian. The writing system is called cuneiform. And you can see the evolution of cuneiform on the slide in front of you. Look at the top row for sag, head. You can see top left, it looks very much like a head, but as we move right through that row, it slowly changes shape. When we get to the far right, it looks nothing like a head. The same might be said for carp. In the bottom row, you have what looks like three fish, slowly transforming into just a bundle of lines. This is the transformation of picture to word, picture to written, agreed upon symbol. As we move through what makes up our first complex society, and we have our protection racket, the state, we have a system of writing emerging around the state and its tax collection, the operation of that protection racket. We have our division of labor emerging in the main cities. We're also going to get, alongside that, the development of a fairly complex religion. Ancient Sumer was a world of many gods. The most powerful was the storm god Enlil, E-N-L-I-L, who controlled storms and floods. Now, these gods were neither omniscient, nor omnipotent, nor objective. They're given to whims, jealousy, anger, happiness, favor, whatever. They fought with their families, and they often gave in to their emotions and desires. The biggest building in the city-state of Uruk would have been the temple to Ishtar. Now, Ishtar is the protective deity of Uruk. She is the storm god's daughter, so sometimes she's Enlil's daughter, sometimes she is, depending on your mythology, the daughter of a different god, but in any case, she is the protector of Uruk. This temple ground could sometimes hold up to 1,000 people. And what would have been sitting at the middle of this temple ground is something like, not exactly the same thing, this is a representation, what you see pictured here, a ziggurat. Now, this is a place, this ziggurat, inside the temple where religious ceremonies would have been performed. Maybe you need to prepare for the harvest, or thank for a good harvest, or prepare for war, or coronate a king, or hold a funeral for someone very important. All of these things are going to happen at this temple to Ishtar, at this ziggurat, looking something like what you see pictured here. In this world, the king was an intermediary to the gods. Gilgamesh himself was thought to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. I don't understand a lot about that math, but that's what they say. And Ishtar, the protector of Uruk, at one point in the story, actually tries to marry him. The problem is this. All of Ishtar's previous spouses had come to bad ends. Many of them had essentially died. And Ishtar she gets rejected. Gilgamesh says, there's no way. It's bad luck to marry you. I'll wind up dead. No, thank you. I don't want any part of this deal. Ishtar, feelings hurt, has her father send the bull of heaven down to destroy the entire city of Uruk. This is the point in the story then where Enkidu kills the bull. and then suffers consequences. The gods decided no. Now we are allowed, the gods say, to involve ourselves in human affairs. If you do not do what pleases us, we can do things like send the bull of heaven to destroy your city, but you may not fight back. That is not allowed. So Enkidu kills the bull of heaven. This is a major problem. The gods decide that Enkidu must die. And he does. Enkidu then describes the world of the dead in the Epic of Gilgamesh and gives us a look into what Sumerians would have thought the afterlife was like. Enkidu says, "To the houses whence none who enters comes forth, on the road from which there is no way back, to the house whose dwellers are deprived of light, where dust is their fare and their food is clay. They are dressed like birds in feather garments. Yea, they shall see no daylight, for they abide in darkness." A little grim, but this is the underworld, the land of the dead of the Sumerians. There's also then the issue of how this government, which again, I'm encouraging you to think of at all times at its core as a protection racket, although it's more than a protection racket. How was this government actually assembled? How did it operate? Well, early versions of Gilgamesh reveal that the king ruled with a few assemblies of advisors of different types, usually elders and young men. Between 2900 and 2334 BCE, settlers would have moved from Uruk to build new city-states closer to natural resources that they needed. We said earlier, this is a region doesn't have a lot of rainfall. In the story, Gilgamesh and Enkidu have to go to a cedar forest to get lumber to bring it back down to where they live because there is no lumber. So people are moving around to get better access to better farmland, to lumber, to those kinds of things. The first ruler of all of Sumer, so the first person to take all these little city-states that are spreading out and unite them under one person's power. The first ruler of all of Sumer was Sargon of Akkad. And he is the first to establish not a city-state, but a form of government that's going to be with us throughout the pre-modern world, an empire. Now, an empire is a large territory in which one people rule over other subject peoples with different languages and different religious traditions, sometimes answering to different forms of law and things like that. It really is a very different system from the modern nation state. Earlier I said one way that government in the modern world is different is there's at least the pretense that the state is a place where different classes, different groups of people struggle over how are we going to distribute resources, what will be the law, that kind of thing. And in the pre-modern world, it's just in terms of decision making, it's a one-way street. Although, a king or a queen always has to react to unhappy people. There are always more people than there are monarchs. So there is some give and take there. But here with empire, we get another difference. The difference is that in a nation state, you think about the United States, think about anywhere in, say, Europe or something like that. There's a sort of basic presumption that the people of that nation, however they define themselves, rule themselves. And they do not rule over other people. Now, the whole history of colonialism makes that difficult, and I'm happy for this to be too simple a definition, but just stick with me nonetheless. So the idea is, there's a nation of people, a group of people, an ethnicity of people, something like that, and they have a right to govern themselves. They do not have a right to govern other people, and if they are governed by someone else, another different group, they have the right to overthrow that group, right? That's a sort of very simple, basic idea of the relationship between nation and state in the modern world. Empire does not work that way. In empire, there's far more flexibility. There's far more ability of the emperor to say, okay, you have a different set of gods. That's fine as long as you pay your taxes. Oh, you have slightly different rules. That works for me as long as you pay your taxes. Oh, you speak a different language. Well, as long as the elites can read the rules and laws that I'm sending to you everyone else is welcome to speak that different language. There's no call for everyone to be the same people, to have the same language, to have the same cultural practices. It's just not necessary. And for that reason, empires are, in many cases, huge. What keeps them long-lasting, however, is a subject for later lectures. Anyway, with that aside, Sargon and his sons ruled over Mesopotamia for about 100 years. Trading networks extended into central Turkey from Sumer, where they are ruling, and Sargon replaced the language of Sumerian with the language of Akkadian for official documents and things like that. So we're starting to see a bit of a standardization at government level, and this should make sense. He is, at least at this point in the human record, ruling quite a large territory compared to previous states, and he needs everyone in that territory to be able to read and understand and follow the same rules. So he's standardizing the language, requiring all elites to be able to read and write this language for simple means of communication among the ruling class. Once the Akkadian Empire falls, Mesopotamia breaks into several different kingdoms. About 2200 BCE, a new city called Babylon, a bit north of where Uruk had originally been, becomes very powerful. And Babylon was a city-state ruled by military leaders until the great military and legal leader, Hammurabi, about whom you may have heard, unified much of Mesopotamia. Now, most people, hopefully, have heard about Hammurabi's laws. You know an eye for an eye and things like that. The entire code, however, contained more than 300 policies on slaves, policies on divorce, policies on criminal punishments, and policies even down to interest rates. This was, I want to warn you, however, not actually a law that anyone followed. So Hammurabi's law, despite its fame, was not something that judges under Hammurabi's rule would have been using. It was aspirational. It was there to demonstrate his wisdom. It was there to stabilize his rule because future generations, should something happen, could consult this law to build the kind of ideal society that Hammurabi had envisioned. Now, under his society in Babylon, we get the emergence again of social classes. We have an elite group in this kingdom, royal families, priests, merchants, and landowners. We get a middle class of sorts here made up of commoners and peasants. And finally, very common in the pre-modern world, the lowest rung of society is going to be enslaved people, most often prisoners of war. And that's most often everywhere in the pre-modern world. Equality under the law was only for people of the same class. So, an eye for an eye was true if two people from the elite classes were fighting. An eye for an eye is true if two slaves are fighting. An eye for an eye is not true if an elite person takes out a slave person's eye. Then a different code gets enforced. So it's equality under the law for certain categories of people. In the code, there's an awful lot of attention paid to marriage. A lot of different kinds of policies on women, their lives, how they should be treated, and how they are supposed to enter into and, in certain circumstances, leave relationships with men. So the code required that women and men be married through written contract. You could not just agree that you were married orally. Women in this society were allowed to inherit a share of their parents' property, which is a very significant economic right and not one that women enjoyed everywhere. When it gets to adultery, however, things get a bit shaky. So adulterers, if you're found in the act, were to be tied together and drowned, unless the husband said that the wife could live. So if you're in a case of a woman cheating on her husband, there her life is really in her husband's hands. It depends on his mood. If the woman was accused of adultery, but there was no evidence produced that this adultery had happened, then the woman could take an oath in front of a god that they had not committed adultery and would not commit adultery, and then they were free to go home. If the husband committed adultery. So if the husband sleeps with someone outside the marriage, the woman does not have the right for this husband to be tied to that person and drowned, but the woman does have the right to ask for a divorce. So not equal by any stretch of the imagination, but interesting and intricate nonetheless. So Babylonia as a kingdom was short-lived. Hammurabi's dynasty ended when the Hittites, who we'll look at in the next video, attacked and conquered the city in 1595. So Hammurabi's Code, major literary and legal achievement, not something anybody actually practiced, but I would say telling of the values of this world nonetheless. When we reconvene, we will talk about Egypt, we will talk about the Hittites, the Hebrews, Neo-Babylonia. It's going to be a lot in just a little bit of time. So I will see you then.